Hi guys, I'm Charlie from Common Stitch and today we'll be sewing up the Baby Bellbird Romper. I have pre-cut mine and I've got it in a size 1, and so this will be for one of my little twins, Alfie, so we can check the fit on her at the end. I am trying to make the most of nap time today, so I've got my monitor up on my phone, so if you hear any baby crying in the background, it's time for me to stop filming, but I'll try and get as much done today as I can. So let's get sewing. Alright, step 1, we're joining the front to the back through the shoulder seam, and I've got my fabric right side to right side. With my fabric there's clearly a right and a wrong side. If your fabric, it's hard to tell the difference. Just make sure you keep track as to which is your left and your right side on the front, because they are a little bit different. But I'm going to be joining those through the shoulder, 1 centimeter seam allowance. Then I'm going to jump on my overlocker and then iron it towards the back. Jumped up to the ironing board and I'm going to press my binding. So I've cut this on the bias. I added a little join to mine just to use a bit less fabric. And I like to use this tool. So what I do is I pop one of the angled edges through and I use my pin to bring it through a bit better, just to get the start going. And then I grab my iron and I slide the binding maker down as I'm pressing the binding. And as you can see, it like folds it over. And then you've got binding made to match your garment. Alright, so we are up to step 3. So next we'll be attaching the binding down the front and around the neckline and down the other side. So starting on the right side of your fabric, at the bottom point, I'm going to attach my binding. So I'm going to put the raw edge of my binding on top of the raw edge of the garment, and then I'm going to stitch in that ditch, which is the 6 mils we just pressed when we were making our binding. I'm going to have a little bit of tension on the binding as I sew, but not pulling it too tight. We don't want to create any gathers. So I've gone all the way around, down one side, around the back neck, and down the other. And for the next step, we then roll it all in towards the inside of the garment, and then we stitch along that edge. So we've just jumped up to show you a little close-up view of what we've done. So as you can see here, so when the garment was the good side of the fabric facing outwards, I'd stitched my binding on in that ditch, in that 6 centimeter ditch that I'd just pressed. And I'd done that all the way around. And now I'm up to the next step where I'm rolling it into the inside of the garment. So I'm keeping that edge folded in, and I'm doing a little pin stitch along that folded edge. And I'm going to continue this all the way along. So I've stitched my binding on. I'm just going to jump up at the iron and give it a good press. And then I'm up to step number 5 where I'll be sewing in the sleeves. I'm doing the long sleeve version, but there's also an option to have it sleeveless where you follow a similar method with that previous binding, and that will go around your armholes. So I've just given that a good press. I like to iron things as I go because it means it has like a nice crisp finish when you've completed the garment. So here I've got my sleeves. I've got 2, a left and a right, and I'm going to stitch those into the armholes. So with my fabric right side to right side, I'm going to stitch it in with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Just going nice and slow and bringing the curves up to one another. So that's one sleeve, and I'm just going to repeat this process with the other, stitching the curve of the sleeve into the curve of the armhole. You can use pins at that point if you think it will help you, but I like to just sort of pull it and manipulate it as I go. So now I've got both sleeves in, I'm going to overlock those seams and give them a press. So I just thought I'd pop on here and show you with step 5. With the top version, I'm going to do it sleeveless. So I've made my bias binding, and I'm going to just use the exact same process that I just did for the neckline, but I'm just going to do it around the armholes this time. So starting on the right side of the garment, I'm going to stitch on my bias binding. And rolling it into the inside of the garment. And I'm going to repeat this process on the other armhole. So I've just jumped back up to the iron and I'm going to press my ties. I'm just making these so they match my fabric, so I'm making them out of my fabric, but if you want you could use like a pre-made cotton knitted cable or a ribbon or something like that, just to make it a little bit more simple. But today I'm going to press my own. So what I'm doing is I'm folding down the length 6 mil. And down the other one. And one of the edges I'm going to fold down as well, one of the shorter edges. And then I'm going to fold the whole thing in half. So as I'm sewing, I'm going to neaten up this end and just sort of tuck those folds in a bit. And I'm going to stitch all the way down those two edges. So I'm going to repeat this process 8 times for all of my ties. Alright, so I've pressed my 8 ties and now I'm going to stitch them closed along the 2 smaller folded edges. So now we're up to step 7. So we're closing the side seams. So with the front piece that's got the flat straight edge, on that side we're going to encase the ties in the side seam. So using the little notches on our pattern piece, we're going to mark where the ties go, and they're going to get sewn between the front and the back pieces. I'm going to stitch along that edge, 1 centimeter seam allowance, and then I'm going to overlock and press it towards the back. This stitch goes down the side seam and then we take it all the way down the sleeve as well if you're making the long sleeve one, or you just double back once you get to the armpit if you're doing the sleeveless version. And this makes it so the ties are hanging through the side seam. And now we're going to close the other side, so we don't have to worry about any ties on this one. So we're putting the front to the back and closing down the side seam. So I'm just up to step 9, and this is the top instructions. So I'm just up to hemming it. So the straight edge along the bottom, I've just overlocked and I've pressed it up 1 centimeter, and now I'm going to stitch it down. And now we're up to attaching the ties, which is the same process as the romper. So this step is just like a little optional extra, but I recommend you doing it because it makes the snap fasteners go through an extra layer, which gives it a bit more strength. There's nothing worse than your snap fasteners like popping off when you're trying to undo it on a baby. So I've got some iron-on interfacing here. You just need a tiny amount, so it's a great way to use any scrap pieces you have, or if you have to buy some, just try and get the smallest amount possible. So I'm just going to cut a piece for my front facing and a piece for my back facing. And then making sure you've got the glue side facing the fabric. You don't want to accidentally iron it onto your ironing board. I've definitely made that mistake a few times. And I get on. Sometimes it's best to have a piece of scrap fabric over the top just to make sure that you don't get any glue on your iron, sorry. But I'm just going to quickly do it. And that's all done. Alright, so next up I have overlocked the short edges on both of my facings. And I'm going to jump up to the iron and press those in 1 centimetre. And then I'm going to stitch it down. So at this point, I'm going to show you where we attach the facings. So with the right side of your garment facing up, we're just going to put the front facing in that little front crotch section and the back facing in the little back crotch section. We'll just pop a couple of pins so they stay there. And then while we're here, I'm going to show you how I work out the elastic measurements. This is just a good rule to go off, but if your elastic's super stretchy, you might find that you need to like unpick it and then take a little bit extra out. So you work out what works best for you. I have here 8mm elastic. And so what I do is I just walk it around without stretching it, this leg curve, so I can see how big the area is. And then we say to use 75%. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold it in half and then in half again. And I'm going to use that as my marking to cut it. So just making sure I cut through one layer. And then that piece there, when it's stretched into place, will be the right measurement for that hole. So we're repeating this process through this little section here, through this bit, and then also through this bit, just through the curve of the leg hole. We're not going to take it along the straight edge. That's just going to get folded up. This next step, I'm going to stitch the facings into place. So it's just a 1 centimetre seam allowance, and I'm just going to stitch along that edge. And you'll see here I've also cut all of my elastic pieces and I've just pinned them into place so I don't get them mixed up. And I've just pinned them on the inside of the garment because that's where we will be overlocking them on. These will eventually get rolled into the inside of the garment and create like a nice little section where we'll put our press studs. But for now, I'm going to keep it rolled outwards and I'm just going to jump onto the overlocker. So I've just overlocked that edge of the facing. This will just give it a nice finish when it's rolled onto the inside and stop any fraying. And while I'm at the overlocker, I'm going to overlock my elastic into place. So on the inside of the garment, I've got my piece of elastic pinned there. And so I'm going to be like stretching it as I go until it goes from the side seam to the edge of the facing. And then I'm going to go from the edge of one facing to the edge of the other facing. And the last edge of the facing to the front of the garment. So I'm going to be pulling the elastic as I go and overlocking it in place. So if I slide it under my overlocker, get a couple of stitches going, stretch it to the length, and overlock it on. so it gives it like a little bit of gather. You may find with your elastic, if it's not giving you enough gather, you can unpick it and just make your elastic a little bit smaller. I'm going to repeat that process in the other two sections. With the bigger section, you might find it helps if you stretch it all of the way, just to get an idea of where it needs to be, and then pick a closer section and hold it there. That way you're making sure you've got an even gather the whole way along. And that's the other one. And one more to go. I find it easier if I make sure the needles are up when I'm sliding it in. That way I can really get the elastic in underneath. Try not to cut any of the elastic with your overlocker, just trimming off a little bit of the frayed edge of the fabric as you go. Now I'm just going to overlock along this edge as well. So at this stage now, we're going to like roll the facings into the inside of the garment. So I've done that with the back one, and I'm going to do the same with the front one. Flip it around, and I'm going to give it a good press. And it sounds like a baby's just woken up. Also at this stage too, I'm going to just press this straight front edge. Just get that tie out of the way. And it's just going to get folded up once. And give it a good iron. And so now I'm going to stitch down that front edge. I'm going to roll the elastic so it's encased. I'm going to stitch along that elasticated edge. I'm going to stitch along the facing, keeping that down. I'm going to roll this elasticated edge in as well, stretching it out as I go so the elastic's sitting nice and flat. And I'm going to stitch that facing edge and all the way along, stretching out this elastic. And finish up there. So we've got our straight edge, the leg holes overlocked and the elastic sewn in, the facings in place. Now we're up to the last couple of steps. Now I'm going to hem my sleeves. So I've just overlocked around the edge and I'm going to fold it in 2 centimeters and stitch it down. because it's so small, I just try and like fold it into place, and I just sew a little bit, readjust my fingers, and then sew a little bit more. And I do the same on the other sleeve. When we're working out where to put the ties, I like to lay my garment out flat, and the side that's got the straight edge, I flop that across, and we're going to be tacking some ties into that seam. I just like to visually lay it out so I can see what ties are tying to what. And then I know that the other set of ties are going to flop across, and they will tie to the ones that we sewed on earlier into the side seam. Okay, so I'm going to grab the back, and on the right side of my fabric, I'm going to put in the center one of those pieces. So it goes into my device like so. And then I'm going to put the gripper end in as well. And then I'm going to, in the center, and clamp it on, pushing as hard as you can. And there we've got one in place. So I'm going to repeat this process, so I've got 3 on that edge. Okay, so I've got those ones in place, and now I'm going to do the same process but with the other side of the press studs on the front facing. So I'm going to flip it over, put my press studs in place, and on the center of the facing, pushing nice and hard, and we've got one. I'm going to repeat this process for the other 2.